Hi guys, so today we're here with Professor Snyder from Georgia State University. First of all, thank you for being here. And then can you introduce yourself, basically what your research was about and what's your academic background?
Sure. So thank you so much for having me. My name's Susan Snyder, and my research emerged from my practice experience. So I worked for over a decade with children and youth who were involved in the child welfare system. And I was really concerned that the kids with the worst outcomes had problems with criminal justice involvement and trying to figure out what were the factors that precipitated that. So a lot of my research focuses on early childhood trauma and its
Yeah.
later impact on problem behaviors.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yep. Yeah. So what basically inspired you to do your research in social work? You kind of talked about it, but like what basically made you go to the social work side?
For me, it was all about justice. So it seemed like there was a really big problem where recognizing trauma wasn't part of the equation. And I think trauma can play a really big role. I know most of your work focuses on refugee children or children in
Uh,
Pakistan who've really struggled with unjust situations regarding their labor. Those kinds of concerns also impact my research and my interests. I want to figure out where are there areas where things aren't quite fair, where there isn't a level playing ground, and where there's a problem that we aren't really fixing. So social work was a field that was really looking at how do we level the playing field and how do we incorporate both research and policy and practice all at
yeah.
once.
Uh-huh. Okay. So, talking about the article that I sent you, your
Yeah.
article, what was the main research question of that article?
So there were a couple. One of them was trying to figure out, do experiences of child physical abuse predict problems during emerging adulthood? So, and by problems, I mean substance use, illegal behaviors. Are those more likely under kids who've been physically abused? And we know that one of the big risk factors for problem behaviors is what are your peers doing? And
Uh,
so I wanted to control for that and say, okay, I get that that is probably even more important than anything else, but let's see if once we control for that, does child physical abuse still matter? And
mm-hmm.
it certainly did.
Okay.
So
Yeah, so in the article you talked about using latent class analysis to examine
yeah,
the behavior typologies. Could you
yeah.
briefly describe that method and like why you
So
chose it?
absolutely. So it's a person-centered form of analysis, but in layman's terms, it just means that you're scouring through the data to figure out what are patterns of behavior. So instead of just having a singular outcome, you're looking to see how do behaviors cluster together. So in the case of substance use and illegal behaviors, you know, are there patterns of using a lot of different kinds of substances and engaging in a lot of different kinds of illegal behaviors? And those folks would be at the most risk. Does that make sense? And they'd
Yeah,
be at
yeah.
the greater risk for being incarcerated and caught by systems. So if we can figure out what risk and protective factors are associated with being in that group or not being in that group, that can be helpful for designing interventions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that was quite helpful.
Okay.
Okay, so you kind of talked about this before, but one of your findings was how like childhood physical abuse, it relates to certain behavior outcomes in emerging adulthood. So could you
Right.
elaborate a bit more on that and then tell us about some potential impacts of that?
Sure. So in the study that you asked about, being in the highest risk group, you were 3 times more likely to be in that group if you'd experienced child physical abuse. And I'm not talking about occasional child physical abuse. I looked at more of the extreme end of the spectrum so
Mm,
that you'd had more enduring, more severe physical abuse. Um, and that was really strongly correlated. So for kids who engaged in a lot of substance use and a lot of illegal behaviors, they were 3 times more likely to have been physically abused or 3 times more
mm,
likely to be in that group if they were physically abused. And the same was true. It was just about 3 times more likely if they engaged in fighting and substance use. So they didn't do everything, but they were fighting with their peers or they were fighting with others. And that's a pretty risky behavior for getting caught in the criminal justice system or sustaining an injury that can be enduring. So knowing that child physical abuse can have those kinds of enduring effects can help us say, okay, we need to intervene and educate parents on different strategies for discipline. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So about that, what do you think could be like steps that people could take to stop that kind of like physical abuse during childhood?
So I worked on an intervention study several years ago where we intervened early. And we caught children in the Chicago child welfare system from birth to 5 years old and helped educate their parents on, okay, how do you bond with a child? How do you see what behaviors are age appropriate? And really helped build up that attachment. That was great for preventing later maltreatment of those kids. And we saw really terrific effects. They stayed out of the child welfare system. So I would say helping parents understand how their behavior affects their child is really key. And a lot of times we learn from our own parents how we parent, right? So we
Yeah.
go into it thinking, oh, this is just what I do because this is what was done to me. But understanding the implications of that can be really helpful, and understanding, how do you have a child on a trajectory that's really optimal? That can also be helpful. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Uh-huh. Yeah. All right. So in the article, you also talk about peer influence, how that impacts the outcomes of adulthood. So how do you think these relationships, the peer relationships, they shape these typologies according to your findings?
So peer relationships play a pretty important role. Now, one of the things that's interesting in some of the longitudinal studies that I've seen is that our peer relationships can start on a negative trajectory pretty early, and that can be influenced by child maltreatment. So kids who've been abused and neglected are more likely to have maladaptive peers all the way through. But our peer relationships can really influence the choices that we make, so pro-socially or negatively. And it can help, guide kids to better decision making if, despite all the trauma they've had, they still find peers that aren't engaging in risk behaviors.
Okay.
So, there's some interesting programs, like the University of Washington has a really cool program um, where they work with kids to prevent them from finding maladaptive peers and spinning out. It's the social development model. So, there are certainly ways that even when the deck of, life's cards are kind of stacked against you, you can
Yeah.
have really good outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah.
kind of another reason to be a social worker, is we can
Mm.
still see, okay, you've got all these risk factors, but that doesn't mean that it's indelible.
Yeah.
Does that
Uh-huh.
make sense?
Yeah. So in your article, you mentioned these different kind of distinct behavioral classes like fighting and substance use, and
Mhm.
then another one was normative. Could you
Right.
describe these groups and like the significance of identifying them in categories, like when you were doing the research?
Right. So when we use latent class analysis, it will go through the data and it will group them based on the probabilities of behaviors. So, groups where kiddos or participants are engaging in a lot of behaviors at the same time. So all the kids that were engaging in just fighting and substance use were put in a group together. All the kids who had just a ton of high risk behaviors, and that's a pretty small group of kids. It was, I think, less than 5%. That was the kids that really were at risk for the worst possible outcomes. And the normative is kind of what you'd expect. That's the biggest slice of pie. That's most
Yeah.
kids. Most kids are doing really well um, and don't have a lot of problem behaviors. But there are smaller groups that are having bigger problems. So being able to look at this in a more nuanced way than just, are you violent? Or are you using substances, gives us a more in-depth understanding of what factors could impact success in treatment, right?
Yeah.
So if you had someone in a substance use treatment program and you didn't know that they had a proclivity or tendency towards antisocial behavior, you don't know that their risk factors for success are actually higher. Like they're not going to do as well. They're going to drop out. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. Okay, so now I want to get to like the theoretical frameworks and like
Sure.
the applications based on those.
Sure.
So how did the theories of the cycles of violence and social learning influence your research approach?
So I was really interested in the theories of cycle of violence. Like that's a really old theory. Your parents and grandparents probably weren't even born when these theories came out. But we kind of from a very, very early time in sociology started looking at, okay, does child maltreatment begat problem behavior? And even in the earliest, most, basic studies, we saw trends. And so I wanted to look at that and see, okay, is that still the case today? Does child maltreatment still, particularly physical abuse, still increase the odds of violence? And is it also really related to substance use? Because we do see that, folks who are engaged in a lot of antisocial behavior are also often engaged in a lot of substance use. So that was one of the reasons I wanted to look at that theory and kind of tweak my application a little bit. I wanted to look at social learning because that's a criminological theory that's applied a lot of the time to say, okay, we engage in behaviors because we learn them. Like you might be an outstanding academic student and professional because that's been modeled for you. You've seen people that have inspired you and have driven you to excel and succeed. And it might be that your parents had messages for you that were really powerful and you listened and heard them because you saw something in them that resonated with you or you felt their love or something like that, right? So
Yeah.
that's what social learning theory kind of says is, okay, if I get my social connection from somebody who's doing things the right way, I'll do things the right way. But if I get my social connection and that, affinity from somebody who's not going on a path that's ideal, then I'm more likely to do that. So that was the rationale for using that theory.
Yeah, okay. So what surprised you the most about how factors like race, age, and education impacted the likelihood of certain behaviors?
Well, I don't know that I was surprised, but I think that one of the things that as a society we tend to think is that kids who are African American may be using substances at higher rates, and they actually use them at much lower rates. There's a crossover effect theory that explains that really there's something protective in African American families that we don't often realize or look at, and it could be applied to other kids to prevent their substance use. So white kids use drugs at much, much higher rates than other racial groups. I think that's interesting because I think there's a tendency in larger culture to idealize in a race-based
Yeah,
groups that shouldn't be idealized. Does that make sense?
yeah, yeah.
So
No,
I
I get
like to flip that on its head and really kind of shine light on that because I think that there are strengths in these communities that we as a society don't always expect to see, but that could be very helpful for
uh-huh.
protecting society at large.
Yeah. Okay. So this question, like, what's your basically favorite thing about your research? Like favorite finding or favorite like part of the research?
I think I really like being able to see the impact of childhood trauma because I think that that gives a compelling case for why it's problematic, but also can be really validating for folks in treatment to understand and recognize their trajectory for how they got to where they are, right? So
Yeah.
if someone's misusing substances and they really can't wrap their brain around what happened and think that they're defective, helping them see that all the trauma that they endured played a role in both epigenetics, so activating genes that make them more responsive to depression, to anxiety, and to addiction, um, helps them feel often better about themselves. So that makes me
Yeah.
excited.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's a great thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So given your findings, what future research directions do you think you can see as like essential for understanding or addressing these issues?
Well, I'd like to see more research on trauma and substance use in particular. Um, because I think, especially during the opioid epidemic,
Mm,
22 adolescents are dying each week, or at least that was the statistic in 2022. So if we have 22 adolescents passing away because of substance use, we should really understand what undergirds that and do our best to prevent that. And I think trauma plays a pretty significant role from what I've seen in the literature. And so understanding that and trying to prevent that is really key in saving lives.
Yeah. So what do you think are some practical implications of your work for social workers or policymakers who are like aiming to reduce risky behaviors in young adults? Some steps that they could take?
I think that we need more funding for programs that address trauma. That really
Yeah.
is largely absent from substance use treatment. And even from juvenile delinquency centers, there's very few that have a focus on what folks have endured. And we look at the disparities. Trauma plays a really key role in decision making and in behaviors. So I would want a lot of funding to go towards both, having a trauma informed lens to work on the ground with people, but also to have a better research infrastructure for understanding the role trauma plays and for intervening to stop the effects of trauma.
Yeah. Okay. So lastly, do you think, is there a key takeaway from your research that you believe that's like essential to educators, parents, or society to understand?
I think the biggest takeaway is that, we have to be aware that the things that happen in our childhood continue to affect us as we're adults, right? And
Yeah.
so being cognizant of that and really being compassionate towards ourselves and others and looking for ways of healing only makes us more kind and better as a society. So that would be what I'd advocate for, is just really recognizing that pain and not being afraid of it, but just finding ways to work through it.
Yeah. All right. So I had a great time talking to you. It was really like helpful because I'm kind of like
So
new
glad.
into this stuff. So it really helped me out.
I'm
So
so glad. If I can ever help you in any way, please don't hesitate to reach out. And I'm excited to see what you'll do. As a junior in high school, you've already accomplished so much that's really impressive. So I wish you the very best. And thanks so
thank
much
you.
for reaching out.
Yep. No, thank you for coming. It was great talking to you.
You as
Yeah.
well. Take good care.
Yeah. You too. All right. Have a good day.
You too. Bye bye.
Bye.